The morning General Harlan Voss pointed at her and said, "Get her out of my briefing room." Nobody in the Forward Operations Center moved for 3 full seconds. Not because they disagreed with him. Harlan Voss was a 2-star general with 41 years of military service. A man who had planned extraction operations in Fallujah, who had held together a collapsing command post in Kandahar with nothing but field wire and bad coffee, whose name appeared in 3 separate Congressional Intelligence Committee reports as essential to the success of the mission. When General Voss pointed at something and ordered it removed, that something moved. The hesitation came from something else entirely. None of them. Not Colonel Marcus Dawson standing stiffly beside the door, not Major Priya Renfrew who had her hand hovering uselessly over a tablet, not the dozen intelligence analysts and logistics specialists pressed shoulder to shoulder against the plywood walls of the cramped Forward Operations Center at FOB Kestrel, could figure out who the woman in the gray civilian jacket was, or why she was standing at the front of the room with one hand resting flat on the mission briefing board as if it belonged to her. She didn't look dangerous. She didn't look like much of anything, in the particular way that some people are capable of occupying a room without seeming to occupy it at all. Medium height, maybe 5'6". Dark hair pulled back in a loose, slightly uneven knot at the base of her neck. Wire-rimmed glasses, the cheap kind you bought at a pharmacy. A white coffee cup in her left hand that read world's okayest everything in faded block letters. She looked like someone's graduate school thesis advisor. She looked like a mid-level analyst who had maybe gotten on the wrong transport and ended up here, 40 kilometers from the Syrian border, inside a classified mission debrief for Operation Hollow Crown, entirely by accident. She looked, in short, like someone who should not be standing at the front of this room. Before we continue, please comment below where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe to the She-Force Tales channel. I said, General Voss repeated, each word precisely separated. Get her out. The woman took a slow sip of her coffee. I heard you the first time, General, she said. Her voice was unhurried, conversational, the kind of voice that belonged to someone reading a grocery list. I was waiting to see if anyone was going to tell you who I am before I had to do it myself. She set the coffee cup down on the edge of the briefing table with a small, deliberate click. My name is Captain Mara Solano. She reached up and touched the corner of the mission board with 2 fingers, not pointing at anything yet, just resting there. And the operation you're about to order, the one you're all looking at right now, I ran it 18 months ago, the unacknowledged version, the one that didn't get a PowerPoint deck. She paused. I have 312 confirmed kills on record, General Voss. Every single one of them took place inside the operational corridor you're currently planning to walk your people into without adequate intelligence support. The room had gone so quiet that someone's radio, turned to static somewhere in the corner, suddenly sounded very loud. General Voss's jaw tightened. His eyes moved from her face to the board and back. There was a specific expression that appeared on the faces of powerful men when someone in a situation they controlled said something that didn't fit, a kind of recalibrating stillness, like a machine encountering unexpected input. That expression was on his face now. Get, he said, one syllable at a time, with surgical precision, her, out. Nobody moved. FOB Kestrel had existed for 11 months, which in terms of forward operating bases in the region was practically middle-aged. It had a perimeter wall of HESCO barriers that were beginning to lean in a few places, 3 prefabricated buildings that housed command, comms, and medical, a row of sleeping quarters that were half tents and half shipping containers, and a motor pool that smelled permanently of diesel and burned rubber. It was, in other words, exactly like every other forward operating base that had ever existed in every other patch of contested ground since men had first decided to occupy patches of contested ground. Functional, uncomfortable, and faintly improvised in the way of things built to last 6 months that had now lasted 11. Captain Mara Solano had arrived at Kestrel at 4:30 that morning, alone, on a military transport helicopter that had landed without advance notice being given to the base. She had stepped off with a single duffel bag, a laptop case, and a coffee cup. She had shown her credentials to the gate officer on duty, a 23-year-old corporal named Ellis who would later tell people he'd been weirdly unsettled by the exchange without being able to explain why, and asked to be taken to the operations center. She had not been escorted. Corporal Ellis had pointed her toward Building 2 and gone back to his post, because nothing about this woman suggested she required management. She had found the operations center locked. She had waited outside it on an overturned equipment crate, drinking her coffee for 40 minutes until Colonel Dawson arrived for the 5:30 pre-brief and found her sitting there. "Can I help you?" Dawson had said. "Probably," she'd said. "I'm here for Hollow Crown." Dawson had studied her the way you study something you found in your house that you don't recognize. Not alarmed, not exactly, but cautious in the way that suggested he was deciding whether he needed to be. She had no rank insignia visible. The civilian jacket, the glasses, the battered coffee cup. "And you are," he'd said. "Captain Mara Solano, DI," she'd said. "I sent the briefing request 2 weeks ago. Someone apparently didn't forward it." She said this without any particular edge, not as an accusation, just as a fact, noted and set aside, like a piece of furniture placed inconveniently. Dawson had let her in. He wasn't sure later why he hadn't asked more questions. Something about the way she'd said it, not demanding, not apologetic, just factual, had made him treat it as settled. She had gone straight to the mission board, set her bag down, opened her laptop, and been there for 20 minutes before the room filled up. General Voss had come in at 6 o'clock. He'd scanned the room the way generals scan rooms, a fast, comprehensive sweep that organized everything and everyone into categories of relevance. And he noted her the way he noted the coffee urn in the corner. Furniture. Then someone had called the briefing to order, and she'd gone to the board, and Voss had said, "Who is that?" And no one had answered immediately, and the answer he got when he pressed, "A DI liaison, sir. She was here when we arrived," was not sufficient, and then he told her to get out, and she'd said what she'd said, and now 40 people were standing in a room that had gone very still. Major Renfrew broke the silence first. She was the youngest ranking officer in the room, which perhaps made her simultaneously the most afraid of General Voss and the most likely to say something nobody else wanted to. "Sir," Renfrew said carefully, "if she's cleared DI dash." "I don't care if she's cleared by the president himself," Voss said, and his voice had the quality of something being controlled with great deliberateness. A blade kept in its sheath not because it was harmless, but because the time hadn't come. "I don't know this woman. She isn't on my personnel roster. She didn't go through my command to get here. And I am not going to run a classified operation with an unknown variable standing at my mission board." He looked directly at Mara Solano as he said it. She looked back at him over the rim of her glasses. Something in her expression suggested she was listening with interest, the way a professor listens to a student about to demonstrate they haven't done the reading. "She's not unknown, sir," said a voice from the back of the room. Everyone turned. Staff Sergeant Daniel Okafor, 29 years old, had been standing against the far wall since the briefing started. He was one of 3 JSOC liaison personnel who'd been at Kestrel for the past month, and he had been very quiet for the entire duration of the scene that had just unfolded. He was still quiet, but he was also no longer looking at the floor. "I know who she is," Okafor said. The room looked at him. General Voss looked at him. "Do you want to share that with the group, Sergeant?" Voss said. Okafor hesitated. It was a small hesitation, barely a half second, but in a room this quiet, it was audible. "Yes, sir," he said. "I think you should hear it. The first thing you needed to understand about Mara Solano," Okafor explained, slowly, carefully, the way you explain something when you know the person listening is going to have a reaction, was that she wasn't a briefing room kind of person. She had been born in El Paso in 1990, the second of 4 children, to a mother who taught middle school mathematics and a father who drove long-haul trucks and came home on Sundays smelling of diesel and fast food. She had grown up in a 2-bedroom house on the east side of the city with a bookshelf that took up an entire wall of the living room, because her mother believed that a house without books was just a storage unit with better furniture. She had read everything, not selectively, not with the focused enthusiasm of a child who has found a specific passion. Just everything, the way some people eat, without particularly thinking about it. History, physics textbooks her mother brought home from school, military biographies, intelligence memoirs, a battered copy of Sun Tzu that had been her grandfather's, the margins filled with his handwriting in Spanish. By 13, she had read it 4 times and had begun arguing, in her school's debate club, using concepts from it that none of her teachers recognized. She had been quiet in the way that some very intelligent people are quiet. Not withdrawn, not shy, but economical. She said what she needed to say and not more. She listened more than she spoke. Her teachers wrote on her report cards that she was thoughtful and self-directed and, once, memorably, a little unsettling. She had joined the Army at 18, which surprised everyone who knew her because she had also been accepted to 3 universities, including one on a partial academic scholarship. She had told her mother, who had cried, that she would go to university eventually, that the Army was something she needed to do first. She had not been able to explain at 18 what she meant by needed. She understood it better now, at 34, though she still didn't have good language for it. Something about wanting to know if she was real, maybe, about needing a measurement. She had been good at everything they put in front of her. Not exceptional, not first. Good. Quietly, consistently, unervingly good, in a way that doesn't get you noticed until someone sits down and looks at all the numbers at once and goes still. She'd qualified for intelligence work at the end of her first year. Her aptitude scores in spatial reasoning, pattern recognition, and foreign language acquisition were high enough that she'd been fast-tracked to the Defense Intelligence Agency's Field Analyst Program. She'd learned Farsi in 8 months. Not conversationally, not good enough to get by, but well enough to catch the nuances of regional dialect that machine translation consistently missed. She'd added Arabic 6 months later, Mandarin 2 years after that, during a deployment cycle that left her with 6 hours a night and the particular motivation of someone who understood exactly what the gap was costing. But the thing that changed everything, the thing that Okafor was building toward carefully and deliberately, because he understood that how you told a story mattered as much as what was in it, happened in her 3rd year, during a training exercise at Fort Bragg that had not been designed for her and had not expected her. The exercise was called Iron Curtain. It was a combined intelligence and marksmanship assessment designed for JSOC support personnel, not an operator qualification, not an attempt to turn analysts into shooters, but a practical field evaluation of analyst capacity to function under sustained physical and psychological pressure. You had to navigate a 9-kilometer course through mixed terrain while carrying a 60-pound pack, solve intelligence puzzles at 5 separate waypoints. And at the end of the course, when you were exhausted, when your hands were not quite steady and your judgment was down a few percentage points from the baseline, you qualified on a bolt-action precision rifle from a stationary position at 500 meters. Most analysts hit somewhere between 40 and 60% on the rifle portion. The course designers had built the standard achievable without extensive weapons training, because the marksmanship was not the point. Mara Solano had hit 97% on the rifle portion and then asked, still breathing heavily from the 9-kilometer run, whether she could try from the 1,000-meter position. The range safety officer had said no. Then he'd looked at her target. Then he'd said yes. She'd hit 89% from 1,000 meters, with a rifle she had fired for the first time that morning. The RSO had called the weapons department. The weapons department had called training command. Training Command had quietly enrolled her in an advanced marksmanship program that was not on her official record. The first of several things about Mara Solano's career that would not appear on her official record. What followed were 4 years that she rarely talked about. Not because of trauma. She would be the first to tell you that trauma was a specific thing and should be used carefully, but because most of it was classified in ways that made talking about it more trouble than it was worth. She had deployed twice to Afghanistan, once to Iraq, and once to a location she was not permitted to name in any document with a classification lower than top secret/SCI. She had operated under 6 different cover identities. She had gone into environments where the nearest American support was sometimes 100 kilometers away, working with local assets whose reliability was at best provisional and at worst actively hostile and hard to distinguish from the former. She had developed, over those years, a particular skill set that the intelligence community classified under a category most people didn't know existed. Not a sniper, exactly, though her precision rifle scores were documented and documented thoroughly. Not a field agent, exactly, though she could hold a cover identity across a 2-week operation without a single seam showing, without the micro-expressions that training officers could usually detect if they watched long enough, without the hesitations and asymmetries that gave people away in languages that weren't their first. Something between the two, An analyst who could operate, a shooter who could think, a ghost who could vanish into any environment and come back with information that changed the operational picture entirely. The 312 confirmed kills were not from a single deployment or a single theater. They were accumulated across 7 years of operational work. Some from direct action in the field, some from directed strikes that she had called in based on targeting analysis refined over days and sometimes weeks of patient observation. Some from circumstances that the official reports described with language chosen very carefully for precisely that purpose. The number was not something she had kept track of herself, in the way some people keep track. It lived in files she had never requested to read. She knew it because it had been included in a classified personnel summary she'd received 3 years ago, listed the way you list a qualification or a measurement. She had never talked about it publicly. She had mentioned it this morning for one reason only, and it was not to impress anyone in this room. 18 months earlier, she had stood in another briefing room. This one at Bagram, smaller and better lit, with a broken ceiling fan that knocked rhythmically against its housing every 4 seconds, and delivered the intelligence assessment that had preceded Operation Hollow Crown's original iteration. Nobody had called it Hollow Crown then. It had been Dustfall, and it had been a disaster, and the disaster had not been the intelligence. The intelligence had been correct. Every number she had given them, every location she had flagged, every timing window she had identified as viable, all of it had held. The operation had failed not because the intelligence was wrong, but because someone in the command chain had modified the approach parameters at the last minute without informing the analytical team. And by the time the modification reached the field, 3 elements were already in position based on the original plan. The left hand had not known what the right hand was doing. It was not a news story. It was one of the oldest stories in the long and specific literature of military failure, which was full of variations on the same theme. Somebody changed something and didn't tell someone else who needed to know. 11 people had not come home. She had spent the subsequent 18 months doing 2 things simultaneously. Writing the classified after-action report that was now filed in 3 separate compartments and accessible to fewer than 40 people in the entire intelligence community, and working through every channel available to her to ensure that the second version of the operation, which she had known with the specific certainty of someone who understood the operational logic from the inside, was being planned, did not repeat the same structural failure in the same structural place for the same structural reason. She had submitted 14 formal requests for assignment to the follow-on operations analytical support team. 12 had been declined on procedural grounds. 1 had received no response. 1 had been returned with the notation "under review," which was the bureaucratic equivalent of being placed on a shelf in a room that nobody entered. She had put in the briefing request 2 weeks ago. It had been lost, or ignored, or deliberately set aside. She had long since stopped being able to work up strong feelings about which of those it was, because the result was the same. She had shown up anyway. The room was quiet when Okafor finished. Not the stunned silence of people who had just heard something shocking, though some of them had, but the particular quiet of a space in which something that had been invisible has just been made visible, and the people in the room are still adjusting to seeing it. "She shouldn't even be here," General Voss said. His voice was quieter now. Not softer. Voss's voice didn't do soft, but quieter in a way that was more unsettling than the volume had been. He was looking at a point in the middle distance, not at Okafor, not at Mara Solano. "Her clearance level dash," Colonel Dawson began. "Her clearance level is not the issue, Colonel." Voss cut him off without heat, a surgical interruption. "The issue is that this woman arrived at my base without authorization, without advance notice, without being cleared through my command structure, and is currently standing at my mission board claiming credentials I have not personally verified." He looked at Mara Solano. "You want to be in this room," he said. "Convince me." She looked back at him for a moment. She was still wearing the glasses. The coffee cup was still within reach on the edge of the table. She looked, in this moment, as if she were deciding not whether to answer, but how. Which approach to take, which key to put in which lock. "The 12-kilometer valley approach you're planning to use," she said finally. "The northern route, through the Al Hayat corridor. That's classified." "Yes," she said. "I know, because I wrote the first targeting package on it. 14 months ago. She reached for the laptop beside her and opened it in one smooth motion, the screen facing the room. I know you're planning to use it, because it's the only rational approach given your insertion constraints. I would have made the same choice. But there's a problem with it that wasn't in the data you have. On the screen was a satellite image, timestamped from 6 weeks prior. The Eastern Ridge, she said. 3 positions. They weren't there 18 months ago. They were established 9 weeks ago. She clicked to a second image. These are not static defensive positions. They're rotational, which means someone is funding sustained operational presence in that corridor, which means the approach route is being actively observed. She clicked to a third image, which means if you go in the way you're planning to go and dash. She paused. You'll lose people before you're inside the first kilometer. General Voss looked at the screen for a long time. He looked at Colonel Dawson. He looked at Major Renfrew. He looked at his hands briefly and then back at the screen. How current is this intelligence? He said. 6 weeks for the imagery. Human intelligence sources confirmed the rotation schedule 4 days ago. Why wasn't this in the briefing package? She took her glasses off, folded them carefully, and set them on the table. Because, she said, nobody told me there was a briefing to put it in. What happened next was not a dramatic confrontation. It was something quieter and, in some ways, more significant than that. General Voss asked everyone except Colonel Dawson, Major Renfrew, Sergeant Okafor, and Captain Solano to clear the room. They filed out with a slightly stunned, shuffling quiet of people who had just watched something happen that they weren't sure how to categorize, an event that had the texture of a significant thing, but whose significance they couldn't yet name. The door closed behind them with a soft, solid sound. Voss sat down at the briefing table. For a man who had been standing for the entire preceding exchange, the act of sitting seemed deliberate, a choice, not a concession. He looked across the table at Mara Solano, who had remained at the mission board, and he studied her for a moment with the particular focused attention he usually reserved for maps. You have a file, he said. It wasn't a question. Most people do, she said. I've seen classified files on a great many people, Voss said. I've never seen one that starts the way yours does. He paused, an interval of maybe 3 seconds. I've seen it, Captain. I want you to understand that. I requested it specifically 14 months ago after Dustfall, after the after-action report. Something shifted in Mara Solano's expression. Not surprise. Exactly. She had long since lost the capacity to be straightforwardly surprised by things, but something that required acknowledgement, a small recalibration. As if a variable she'd been treating as unknown had just been assigned a value she hadn't anticipated. You read the after-action, she said. I did. It's filed in 3 compartments. I have access to 4. She looked at him for a moment. Then you know what happened on Dustfall wasn't an intelligence failure. I know, he said. I've known for 14 months. He set his hands flat on the table. A particular gesture, she would come to understand, that he used when he was about to say something he had been carrying for a long time. I also know that you submitted a formal protest through DIA channels that was declined on procedural grounds, and that you submitted a second request for operational review that never received a response. Correct, she said, and that you've been tracking the planning for this follow-on operation through back channels for the past 6 months. She didn't answer that. He took her silence as confirmation. Why didn't you escalate further? He said. You had enough. Your file is dash. He paused, choosing the word with the deliberateness of someone who understood that precision mattered here. Sufficient. More than sufficient. You had the standing to get in front of someone who could have cleared you properly for this operation through official channels in a way that didn't require you to show up uninvited at a forward base 40 kilometers from the border. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke, her voice was the same as it always was, measured, unhurried, but there was something underneath it now, something that Major Renfrew, watching from the edge of the room, would describe later as like a door opening a crack into a very large space. 11 people didn't come home from Dustfall, she said. Not because the intelligence was wrong. Not because anyone on the ground failed at their job. Because someone in a command chair made a last-minute modification and didn't inform the analytical team, and the formal institutional response to that failure, in the 14 months since, has been procedural review. Forms filed. Requests declined. Communications left unanswered. She paused. I escalated through official channels for a full year. The people above those channels were comfortable where they were. She looked at him steadily, directly, without hostility and without apology. So I showed up. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not quite the expression of a man changing his mind, because changing one's mind implies a previous certainty, and he was realizing now that his certainty about this situation had been built on an incomplete picture. "You're aware," he said, "that I still have the authority to have you removed." "Yes," she said, "you could. You have the authority. And you came anyway." "Yes, because you believe the intelligence was critical enough to take that risk." "Yes." He was quiet. "Then, tell me about the Eastern Ridge." She talked for 40 minutes, not performing, not presenting in the managed way of someone navigating an audience, talking the way she talked when the people listening didn't require managing, laying out the intelligence picture in the precise, layered way that had made her analytical work exceptional since the very beginning of her career. She pulled up satellite images and overlaid movement data. She cross-referenced timing windows against known logistical patterns. She identified 3 specific pressure points in the current operational plan that carried unacceptable risk given what she now knew about the rotational positions on the ridge. She proposed 2 targeted modifications that would address each of those pressure points without requiring a complete redesign of the operational approach. Adjustments that preserve the fundamental logic of the plan while removing the 3 places where that logic broke against the new reality on the ground. Colonel Dawson took notes. Major Renfrew took notes. Sergeant Okafor, who had known enough to know this woman was worth listening to long before this morning, stood very still and listened with the full attention of someone filing everything away precisely. General Voss did not take notes. He watched her work. Halfway through, he interrupted once, not to challenge her, not to push back, but to ask a specific and precisely targeted question about source validation on the human intelligence she was referencing, about the chain of custody on the rotation schedule data, and how confident she was in the 4-day currency of that information. She answered directly, completely, and without a single hedge that wasn't itself precise and honest. He nodded once, and she continued. When she finished, there was a silence of a different quality than the silences that had preceded it. Voss stood up. He walked to the mission board and looked at it, the current version, with the planned northern approach laid out in the careful geometric lines of operational planning for a long time. Long enough that the room's quiet shifted from waiting into something else, the particular hell-breath quality of a decision being made by someone who understood that decisions made at this level had specific weights to them. "The northern variant," he said finally, "with the ridge modifications. It gives you a clean corridor," she said. "The rotation timing gives you a 6-hour window beginning at 2 o'clock. The window closes at 8 o'clock. Can you be in the TOC when this runs?" She looked at him. Something in her face was very still. "That's what I came here for," she said. He turned from a board and looked at her directly. In 41 years of service, he had given a very large number of orders, and he had been wrong about a significant number of things, and the ones he had been wrong about had cost him things that did not appear in any official record and could not be recovered. He had learned, imperfectly and over a long time, to recognize the particular combination of evidence and judgment that told you a decision was already made, that the only remaining question was whether you were going to acknowledge it or spend effort pretending you hadn't. "Captain Solano," he said. "Yes, General. You're in the room." She looked at him for a moment. Something in her face shifted in a way that was not a smile, but was related to one, a settling, like a piece of something finding its correct position after being held at the wrong angle for a very long time. "Thank you, sir," she said. There was a pause. "I'm going to need the briefing room reconfigured," she said. "The current layout doesn't give adequate visibility to the modified approach corridor. And I need communications access to 2 sources that aren't currently patched into your comm setup. I'll give the technical specs to whoever manages your signals." Colonel Dawson made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh, quickly covered by a cough. General Voss, for the first time since he had entered this room that morning, looked something that was at least adjacent to amused. "Colonel Dawson," he said, without taking his eyes off her. "Get her whatever she needs." Operation Hollow Crown launched at 0215, 7 days later. It went clean. The Eastern Ridge positions were exactly where Mara Solano's intelligence had placed them, established in exactly the rotational pattern her human sources had confirmed. Following the timing schedule, she had projected to within 11 minutes of actual variance. The 6-hour window she had identified proved accurate. The 3 pressure points she had flagged in the original operational plan were avoided entirely. The approach rerouted through the modified corridor she had calculated, marked, and briefed so thoroughly that every operator entering the field had it memorized down to specific terrain features. The dry creek bed that served as a waypoint, the 2 rock formations on the western slope that marked the edge of the safe lane, the precise compass bearing that kept you out of the ridge's sight lines in. The final 800 meters. The mission objective was secured in 4 hours and 22 minutes. All personnel returned. General Voss was in the TOC when the last team checked in. He stood at the communication station with his hands folded behind his back in the specific posture of someone who has been waiting for a long time and has disciplined themselves not to show it, listening to the confirmation codes arrive one by one over the radio. When the final code came in, the one that meant all elements were out of the operational zone and moving toward extraction, he closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. Mara Solano was across the room at the analytical station, already compiling the post-operation intelligence harvest. She had been awake for 26 hours. Her hair had come partially out of its knot several hours ago, and she hadn't fixed it. The glasses were on. The coffee cup, refilled 3 times during the night from the TOC service table, was at her elbow. When Voss crossed the room to her station, she looked up from the screen. "All out," he said. "I know," she said. "I've been listening." He stood there for a moment. There were things that needed to be said, things that in his experience needed saying, and that he found, not for the first time in his career, resistant to the available language. 41 years had given him very specific channels for very specific kinds of communication, and this one didn't fit any of the standard channels in a way that felt adequate. 14 months ago, he said, "I read your after-action report on Dustfall, and I made 3 phone calls trying to find out where you'd been assigned. Nobody could tell me with any precision." She looked at him steadily. "You made 3 calls?" "Yes. I submitted 14 formal requests." Something crossed his face, not quite shame, but something in its vicinity. Something that acknowledged the asymmetry without flinching from it, and without attempting to rationalize it into something more manageable. "I know," he said. "That's in the record. That failure belongs to the system, and it belongs to the people in it, and that includes me." A pause. "You should have been in this room a year ago." She was quiet for a moment. Outside the TOC, somewhere across the compound, a generator shifted pitch slightly, a low mechanical note that had been there all night and that you stopped hearing after the first few hours. "What matters," she said, "is that they're all out." He looked at her. In the uneven light of the TOC, the overhead panels mixed with the blue-white glow of screens, she looked tired and very young in some respect for someone who had done what she'd done, and very old in others for someone who looked the way she looked. "You're going to be formally assigned to my command as of today," he said. "I'm putting the paperwork through myself. You won't be navigating back channels for the next operation." She raised an eyebrow slightly. "Is that normal procedure for someone you ordered removed from your briefing room 7 days ago?" "No," he said. "Normal procedure is not what this situation calls for." A beat. "I'll also be submitting a formal commendation for your work on the original Dustfall intelligence package," he said. "It should have been submitted 14 months ago. I'm submitting it now, and I'm noting the delay in the commendation itself, because the delay is part of what happened and the record should reflect it." She looked at him for a long moment. The coffee cup was in her hand again, the battered cup with its faded letters. "World's okayest everything." That had been with her through more forward operating bases and more classified briefing rooms and more unreturned requests and more hours of alone in a room with intelligence waiting for someone to listen than she had ever counted. "That's not necessary," she said. "I know it's not necessary," he said. "I'm doing it anyway." She considered this with the specific quality of attention she brought to everything. Not quickly, not dismissively, but measuring it the way she measured distance and timing and the reliability of sources. Then she nodded once with the clean economy of someone for whom one nod meant exactly what other people meant by paragraphs. "All right," she said. Voss turned to go, then stopped. His back was to her. 312, he said. "Yes," she said, "and you showed up alone. There wasn't anyone else available who had the full picture." He stood with his back to her for a moment, looking at the mission board on the far wall, the modified version, with the adjusted corridor marked in her handwriting, which was small and very precise, each letter formed with the same economy she brought to everything else. "Get some sleep, Captain," he said, "after I finish the post-op harvest." He made a sound that was probably a laugh, brief and muffled, and walked away. Major Renfrew had been at the comm station for the preceding exchange and had heard most of it. She waited until General Voss was out of the room before she crossed to Mara Solano's station, moving quietly the way you move in a space where someone is working. She set a fresh coffee down next to the old one. A proper ceramic mug from the makeshift kitchen in the back of the building, still steaming, the kind that had a handle that didn't wobble. "Figured you'd earn an upgrade," Renfrew said. Mara Solano looked at the new cup. Then she looked at the old one. World's okayest everything, faded and worn, the handle slightly discolored from years of use and heat, the kind of object that had been so many places with a person that it had stopped being a thing and started being a reference point. "I'm all right with this one," she said. She went back to the screen. Renfrew stood there for a moment, watching her work, the quiet, focused, unhurried way she moved through data, the same way she'd moved through the briefing room 7 days ago, like someone who already knew where she was going and was simply walking toward it. Then Renfrew nodded to herself, something settling in her expression, and went back to her station. Outside FOB Kestrel, the desert was quiet in the way that places are quiet after something important has happened and the world has not yet caught up to it. The sun was coming up. The sky in the east was going from black to a dark reddish gray, the color of something that had been through fire and was still standing. The HESCO barriers cast long shadows across the hardpack. The motor pool was still. The flag at the center of the compound hung motionless in the absence of wind. Somewhere across the compound, in the JSOC liaison quarters, Sergeant Daniel Okafor was writing a report that he was fairly certain would be read by people he had never met. He was writing it carefully because he had understood from the moment he'd heard her name and known the rest of the room didn't, that she was exactly the kind of person whose story got told incorrectly by default. Smoothed down, edited into something more manageable, more explicable, more comfortable to the people who told it. The number stayed, sometimes, but the context went, the 14 requests and the 3 phone calls and the 40 minutes on an equipment crate waiting for a door to be unlocked and the fact that she had shown up anyway, alone, with a battered coffee cup and intelligence that was going to save lives if anyone would listen to it. He was going to write it correctly. He owed her that much, and beyond that it was simply accurate. And accuracy was the thing he had been trained for and the thing he believed in with the particular conviction of someone who had seen what happened when it was absent. 3 weeks later, a formal commendation for Captain Mara Solano's intelligence work on the original Dustfall operational package was filed with the Defense Intelligence Agency. It was signed by General Harlan Voss, countersigned by Colonel Marcus Dawson, and supported by a witness statement from Staff Sergeant Daniel Okafor that ran to 4 pages. The commendation noted, in the careful and specific language of military formal recognition, that her intelligence assessment had been accurate, her analysis prescient, her identification of the operational risk on the Eastern Ridge critical to the success of the follow-on operation, and her decision to ensure that assessment reached the command through whatever channels were available to her, directly responsible for the preservation of all personnel who participated in Hollow Crown. It also noted, in language that had been drafted and revised several times before reaching its final form, that she had accomplished this without institutional support, without official authorization, without backup of any kind, and without any guarantee that anyone in the room she walked into would choose to listen. The 312 were not mentioned. That number lived in a different category of documents, in compartments with access lists shorter than the guest list at a state dinner, in rooms that were not briefing rooms and that most people would never stand in. Mara Solano read the commendation once, sitting at the analytical station in Building 2 at FOB Kestrel in the early afternoon of a Tuesday that was very quiet. She read it the way she read everything, completely, carefully, without rushing. Then she folded it along its original creases and put it in the outside pocket of her duffel bag, where it settled next to a paperback copy of Sun Tzu with someone else's notes in the margins and a photograph of 4 children that was too worn to read the faces clearly anymore. Then she went back to work. She always went back to work. In the briefing room at FOB Kestrel, which was now, in practical terms, her briefing room, or at least the room where her equipment lived and where people had stopped looking at the door when they found her inside it. There was a coffee cup on the edge of the table. The cup said world's okayest everything. Nobody moved it.